I recently finished replaying Metroid Prime 2 Echoes, and this game is truly one of the most stressful games I've ever played, and that's exactly why I love it. When I initially played this game back in 2004 as a teenager, honestly, I didn't understand it, but now, from the exploration to the music to the aesthetic to even the main premise, I have a much greater appreciation for this game and the era it represents. Metroid Prime 2 is peak 2000s gaming with an intense atmosphere and a very compelling structure, so check it. Metroid Prime 2's world has two parallel worlds, the light world and the dark world. You travel between both of these worlds in order to solve puzzles, find secrets, and uncover the mystery behind Planet Ether and the Luminat. And that's probably the most lore you're gonna get from me, real talk. The entire game is centered around this aspect in various ways. When you're in the dark world, you gradually lose health, and the way this affects exploration and resource management is very bold, especially by today's standards. What intrigued me about this idea is the concept of a game forcing you to take damage. Usually games want to make the player feel like they have some way of avoiding harm, even if they just give you the illusion of being able to avoid harm, like an unavoidable enemy ambush that you had no way of predicting. But Metroid Prime 2 straight up just makes taking damage a part of the experience. And this type of friction that is overtly unavoidable creates a really exciting tension when exploring this game. When I know I have to take damage when going from point A to point B, I'm now calculating how much distance and time I have to get to the end of a room and how much health I have available to survive within that time. The dark world also has recovery bubbles scattered throughout most dark world rooms that protect you from taking damage and gradually recover your health. Enemies drop health as well, and of course you can find health in crates and things like that too. So navigating the dark world has this super interesting dynamic where you're taking damage constantly, but also actively interacting with the environment to recover that health back. It's a very fun push and pull that keeps you on your toes. The resource management also extends to the game's ammo system. Samus will eventually have access to a light beam and a dark beam, and each of them has limited ammo that you replenish by killing enemies with the opposite beam. Certain doors can only be opened with a dark beam and vice versa. Combined with the constant damage you take in the dark world, and you are in a constant cycle of needing resources. One of my favorite examples of how all of this comes together was the Chica boss fight. For this fight, you're going against a giant insect, and on top of that, the fight takes place on some floating platforms in the middle of a poisonous swamp in the dark world. So this fight basically becomes a dance where you're jumping between platforms with your grappling hook to avoid attacks, watching your health drain since you're in the dark world, switching back and forth between light ammo and dark ammo depending on what you need to shoot, all while avoiding the boss's attacks and trying to position yourself to stay inside the recovery bubbles at the same time. It is a beautiful struggle. Now, puzzle solving is a very prominent aspect of Metroid Prime 2, and traveling between the light world and dark world plays a major role in how you'll solve most puzzles. For example, there's an early game puzzle where you run across this translucent looking device. If you scan it, the readings will say that the device is in a state of dimensional flux and that 50% of its atoms are in another dimension or on the surface of dark ether. Basically, the game is communicating to you that you can only interact with this device in the dark world. So I found the dark world portal, went to the location that matched where I found the machine in the light world, morphballed into it, and then solved the puzzle. The game also confirms this with the message saying that trans-dimensional activity was detected. And that's how a lot of the puzzles go. You do things in the dark world that will help you solve puzzles in the light world and vice versa. This means you have to be really observant, take note of your environment, and scan everything so you can keep track of what one world is saying about the other. Most of the time, this is very cool and neat, but there are a few moments where the backtracking between worlds can feel like tedium because the solution is more a matter of just checking everywhere that you haven't been yet, and less about making a clever observation. The end game has a scavenger hunt that perfectly encapsulates that problem, and I'd say this is the game's one major blemish. And to explain this a bit further, towards the end of the game, you will get the ability to swim in poison water, and this plays a major role in the scavenger hunt that I'm talking about, because now the game kind of sort of wants you to go back and check every poison swamp that you avoided and dive in it to find these invisible creatures that will give you the keys to finishing this scavenger hunt. It is a very painful quest that not only tested my patience, but also highlights one of the underlying themes that kept popping up in my replay of Metroid Prime 2 when it comes to how this game handles visual clarity. But more on that later. Let's talk about the combat right quick because it kind of relates to this point. So the bosses and enemies in Metroid Prime 2 are serviceable enough with some interesting ideas here and there. One of my favorite enemies was this ball thing that glitches out your HUD with this charge attack. It's very cool and immerses me in the sci-fi of it all. I like the idea of a game messing with my visual perception in cool thematic ways. On the other hand, some of the visual clarity stuff can be a mixed bag, let me say that. As far as the hits go though, there is a Dark Samus fight that happens that is actually incredible. So at a certain point in the game, you'll get the Dark Visor HUD that lets you see invisible things in the dark world. And during the Dark Samus fight, you have to turn on this visor whenever she turns invisible in order to keep track of her movements and land a hit. Not only is this mechanically engaging, but it's also just visually provocative and again, very sci-fi. Now, the more frustrating visual obscurities, I guess, are with some of the environmental puzzles. Sometimes things blend in with the environment in such a way to where it's hard to tell that you can interact with it. For example, there was this morph ball puzzle where I had to magnetize onto these moving platforms. I eventually figured out that the little shiny sliver was signifying this, but the angles and distance of it all didn't make it very obvious. The visual clarity issue is actually pervasive throughout the game in general and kind of feeds back into my point about some of the backtracking for the end game. It can oftentimes become a game of just checking things at random until something works. I did describe this earlier as a blemish, quote unquote, but as far as my feelings on it looking back, it was a mix of confusion, frustration, and fascination. And I don't necessarily mean any of these words in a negative or positive way, actually. These are just feelings, and I think it's kind of cool that this game took me through a range of emotions. And as I've gotten older and had a chance to replay this game, I've learned to appreciate that aspect of gameplay the same way I can appreciate a music album giving me a variety of emotions with peaks, valleys, and everything in between, as long as I can look back on it and say that it made a meaningful impact on me. And while we're on the topic of the game's visual approach, I want to make sure to talk about this game's overall aesthetic. I've touched on it a bit already in my video about my top 10 underrated game aesthetics, but let's revisit and dive a bit deeper. First of all, the environments in this game blew me away. As someone who is a fan of sci-fi aesthetics, seeing swarms of weird bugs fly past you, little details like how moths gather around Samus in her morph ball form, or walking through these otherworldly areas with the fluorescent glow really made me just go, wow. The atmospheric electronic music also really sets the tone for Prime 2's sci-fi vibe, and once again represents a time in the 2000s when artists like Artetra and Aphex Twin were making an impact with a similar style of music. And the UI for this game brings it all together. The pause menu looks like a rotating molecule and feels very scientific and futuristic. But this game's aesthetic is so underrated. People do not like, They made the menu a molecule that you have to rotate to choose your options. They leaned into this Y2K scientific sci-fi aesthetic. The HUD does a good job of making you feel like you're inside Samus's helmet, not only with the info display, but even the example we discussed earlier with the ball thing that makes your screen glitch out. And of course, there's Metroid Prime 2's infamous game over screen. All of these things did an incredible job of making me feel like I'm in a hostile, intense sci-fi world. This is not a review. I just wanted to talk about the struggle I had to finally see the beauty in what is now one of my favorite games of all time. Comment if you have thoughts, support if you like, and subscribe to support. It's GK. Peace out.